Just on that, so rather pressingly, but the two books I'm actually going to be talking about are Dr. Thorne and The Way We Live Now, which are the two ones coming up on the reading groups. So of course, like Dominic said, if you don't want big spoilers and you've not read them, then perhaps go off and have a cup of tea and come back. but hopefully there'll be a bit of something for everybody anyway. So thank you very much for inviting me to lead this seminar. I thought I'd start off with a little bit about who I am and my project. So I came to Trollope when I was quite young. My grandmother gave me a copy of The Warden when I was 13, and I became more or less obsessed with Trollope. I mean, quite how much of all the subtleties I grasped is probably a bit debatable, but I felt there was something sort of immensely realistic in Trollope in a way that I'd never really seen before. His books felt like they were about real Victorians, which seemed sort of totally revolutionary to me. And the moral question at the heart of Barchester and The Warden struck me deeply. And although as I've got older, I've obviously read more widely, I've always returned to Trollope for comfort and wisdom. And I've now got an MA in Victorian literature, and this talk is an abridged version of my dissertation on Trollope. So I've called this talk Sweetmeats and Sugar-Plums with a question mark, because Trollope tells us at the end of Barchester Towers that the end of a novel should be like a children's dinner party, all sweetmeats and sugar plums, which I'm going to argue is an example of Trollope's quiet sarcasm, and that isn't actually what Trollope gives us in terms of his endings at all. And hopefully, whether you agree or not about Trollope's endings, I think it's fair to say they are something of a curiosity. On the one hand, they have a sort of familiarity and perhaps, dare I say, even predictability that is comforting and reassuring. Trollope often intrudes to tell us how the book is going to end, for example, and usually the young couple overcome the obstacles in their way. Yet, given how I would say one of the central themes of Trollope is sort of balance, and that for many of us, Trollope's books leave us with a feeling that sort of meliorism, harmony, and fairness are the best ways to navigate the world, his endings can be, I think, triumphalist and arbitrary, in which lavish rewards and harsh punishments are doled out with a sort of moral randomness. Are these two views of Trollope then, on the one hand as being committed to fairness and justice, and the other of him as a sort of arbitrary judge passing sentence and dispensing rewards, at all reconcilable? Are his endings fundamentally fair and just? And I think we would agree that a satisfactory ending is one of the most important aspects of a great book. In the end of a work, we perhaps expect the plot to be concluded or the piece's questions answered. We, the readers, finish the book and seal our experience of the text. Psychologically speaking, both beginnings and endings are the parts of the narrative that strike the reader most and the part that sticks with us afterwards. What then makes a good ending? And I think this is a much harder question to answer than what defines a bad ending. Personally, I don't know about you, but I can't tell you how many times I've thought, that was a good book with good ideas or interesting characters, but the ending felt wrong or flat. And perhaps getting a bit sort of philosophical, and I hope I'm not sort of ruminating on a very unique experience here, but an unsatisfactory ending to me is more complicated than, for example, well, that was all a bit sort of convenient, or they didn't make a very good fit as a couple. And I think this is because we tend to place a great deal of pressure on the ending, for we want it to provide a unity or coherence to the book, a sense of completion, and perhaps also a sort of eureka moment of, so that's what they were driving at. And I don't want to say too much more on this point, as I thought our discussion could look at this. But then what is an example of a good ending? By the way, I will freely plagiarize all your ideas, and I think Dom included that in the small print. But on a related point, and again, one I'd like to throw open to the discussion, but when does an ending even begin? Is it once the plot has concluded, or is it just the final words? If the former, for example, we might say The Way We Live Now starts to end about 20 chapters from the final page. And another point that I perhaps don't really address in the body of this talk is that as Trollope wrote two series of interconnected novels, could we say that these works only truly end with a concluding book in each series? Just a few things I'd hoped for us to think about. So Henry James, who was notoriously ambivalent on Trollope, dismisses the sort of ending Trollope provides as simply a distribution at the end of prizes and pensions, husbands and wives, millions, appended paragraphs, and cheerful remarks. And I think James is right to an extent here. Trollope was writing novels for the novel reading public, and he understood that they wanted to be amused and entertained. Yet I think it's important to remember that Trollope also saw his role as an author as being something more than just an entertainer. He says in his autobiography that he sees himself as a preacher of sermons. And in terms of criticism on Trollope, I think very few people look at Trollope from this perspective, but I think it's an important one, as I think we would all agree that Trollope wants us to learn from his fiction, although sometimes the messages can be contradictory and complex. And as a sort of aside here, but Trollope wasn't actually on my reading list for my Victorian novel class, undergraduate, but I think it is this sort of ideological complexity is one of the reasons that Trollope poses a challenge from an academic perspective. In my experience anyway, the discipline required emphatic interpretations. You construct an argument and argue it, coming down on one side or the other. Whereas one of Trollope's charms, I think, is that he isn't emphatic. People's motives and beliefs are nuanced and complicated, and the novels are hard to label with any sort of coherent or overarching message or ideology. So finally, sort of getting to the end of my introduction, but finally, any discussion of endings in Trollope, I think, would be remiss in pointing out that the novels always end with multiple marriages. Yet frequently, when Trollope depicts married life within the novels, the picture is far, far from universally rosy. From the Kennedys of Phineas Finn to the Trevelyan's of He Knew He Was Right, I think it is fair to say that Trollope had a keen interest in showing that marriage, for all its supposedly civilizing properties, wasn't necessarily a guarantee of happiness ever after. So I hope that set the scene a little bit for some of the things I'll be looking at. And so I'm going to look at Dr. Thorne first. And again, apologies for any of the slight spoilers for the big read. So this section called Dr. Thorne, and it's best and fittest to rule. So in my view, I think in many ways, Dr. Thorne is a strong contender for the best Trollope novel. I think the characters have a freshness and reality that Trollope hadn't properly captured up until this point. So again, the spoiler, but the novel ends with the death of the nouveau riche Scatcherds, leaving the illegitimate Mary Thorne the heiress, which is convenient as she is loved by the well-born but poor heir to Greshamsbury, and even more convenient as the Scatcherds were the Greshams' main creditors. Yet it's not often that we find alcoholism and sudden death the source of a Victorian novel's happy resolution, which is just one of the many ironies the novel presents us with. And I think when you think about it, the novel is one of irony in almost every strand. It is ironic that Louis Scatcherd, with all his advantages of education, is just as much of a degenerate as his father. It is ironic that Frank is able to marry Mary and to marry money, two seemingly incompatible stances throughout the book. And it is ironic that this conclusion comes about due to the Scatcherds, to whom the Greshams were indebted. And surely, and last irony, it is intentionally ironic that Frank can enjoy the life of a wealthy and respected aristocrat as the husband of the illegitimate doctor's niece that his father couldn't enjoy as the husband of an earl's daughter. And indeed, Lady Arabella's family, the de Courcys, are a significant presence in this book, and they are jubilant at the novel's close. Perhaps a slightly crude point, but considering they have been ridiculed throughout, is the fact that they are triumphant at the end of a book a reason we might pause at the novel's ending? And again, in speaking of the aristocrats in Dr. Thorne, we might say of Trollope more broadly, there's one passage in Dr. Thorne which is often quoted in the spirit of the novel, and I'm going to give it in full because I think it is quite important, and it's this: England is not yet a commercial country in that sense in which the epithet is used for her, and let us hope that she will not soon become so. She might surely be called feudal England or chivalrous England. If in Western civilized Europe there does exist a nation among whom there are high seigneurs and with whom the owners of the land are the true aristocracy, the aristocracy that is trusted as being best and fittest to rule, that nation is the English. So in terms of kind of academic writings on Dr. Thorne, I noticed this passage comes up in nearly every single piece and is often used to define the novel. One critic declares that this passage shows that the novel's overall message is deeply conservative and that the plot is essentially concerned with how to preserve Greshamsbury and its values. Thus, the ending is, The wonderful joy of victory, the pastoral is established now, and the Scatchards do not die for nothing. And while to a certain extent, I think this isn't a totally sort of wrong-headed interpretation, and I definitely agree that Trollope was interested in the tension between the values of the traditional aristocracy and the emerging capitalist class, I think they miss the obviously tongue-in-cheek nature of this remark. When taken out of context like this, it seems to support a sort of reactionary conservatism. Yet by the end of the novel, are we really expected to believe that Trollope thinks the de Courcys represent the best of nobility, or the remote Duke of Omnium, or even the Greshams themselves? For even though the Greshams belong to the squirearchy class of whom Trollope admired, we are reminded frequently they have brought this near total ruination upon themselves. And I think if we look at the end of the book more closely, specifically, the parallels Trollope creates between the elder and younger Greshams at the end of the book, I think is quite interesting. Trollope reveals that Frank and Mary's income will be between 12 and 14,000 a year, which tellingly is nearly identical to the elder Mr. Gresham when he inherited the estate. And like his father, Frank is also going to attempt to stand for Parliament and become Master of the Hounds. But when we consider that it was these very endeavours that resulted in the absolute ruin of the estate in the first place, it's interesting here that Trollope should create a sort of cyclic pattern with this new generation of Greshams supposedly sort of physically, morally, and fiscally rejuvenated, about to embark on the very mistakes that brought about the near destruction of the estate in the first place. It strikes me that this is the most obvious example of many in Trollope that no one seems to have learned anything by the end of the book. Not only is Frank about to do the same things as his father, Lady Arabella and her relatives don't gain an appreciation for Mary herself, but only for the money that she brings into the clan. So this parallel seems to have been ignored a bit in terms of criticism. Yeah, of course, it was my dissertation, but I think it's a significant point because beneath the sort of jollity of the final chapter, there is a sense that, broadly speaking, the status quo, which brought such calamity, has been sort of maintained. And although, of course, Dr. Thorne is pre-Darwin, there is nonetheless, I think, something sort of Darwinian going on here, that this sort of false renewal masks an inability to learn and adapt from the past. So that's my little section on Dr. Thorne finished. So I'm going to move on to The Way We Live Now. I realise I'm talking quite a lot. So the second section is The Way We Live Now, and this is titled Birds of Prey. I think it's sort of universally accepted that The Way We Live Now is the most cynical book that Trollope wrote. One critic views the novel as an example of the degraded condition of a society which bows down in honour before the money-making power. And I think the ending to The Way We Live Now, in contrast to the sort of ironic veneer of harmony Trollope attempts in other novels, is almost sort of nihilistic. The events of the novel not only precipitate no overarching change in keeping with other books, but we have a sort of unusual ending where all the majorly sympathetic characters, Roger Carberry, Paul Montague, Hetta, Marie, and Mrs. Hurtle, for example, those who possess the virtues that Trollope admires and the virtues this society requires to correct itself, essentially abandon the society. They either withdraw back to their rural enclaves or are forced to leave Britain altogether, which leaves us with a feeling that this is a world which is essentially unsalvageable. So the novel, as I'm sure hopefully many of you are aware, is preoccupied with the machinations of the fraudulent financier Augustus Melmotte, who buys his way into high society and into Parliament on the promise to build an enormous railway. And I think if we first look at Melmotte, whose sort of centrality to the narrative makes his fate of extreme importance to the book, Melmotte is an almost omnipresent figure, with all the characters in some way connected with him or the railway. Some see Melmotte as a symptom of British society, a society increasingly capitalistic, driven and sustained by money alone. This implies that it's the sort of lack of integrity that has allowed Melmotte to thrive, not necessarily because Melmotte himself is especially ingenious or nefarious. Perhaps unsurprisingly, things don't go too well for Melmotte. He overreaches himself, his fraudulent empire proven a scam, and he commits suicide. I don't know about you, but the way things end for Melmotte always sat a little uncomfortably for me, a slight feeling of it being rushed, perhaps. Trollope initially intended for Melmotte's downfall to be exposed through a public trial. However, At some point during the composition, he changed his mind and has Melmotte commit suicide instead. Some claim that the change was for the reasonably straightforward reason that he had used trial scenes near the end of 3 of the last 4 books he had written, and that he required more flexibility in the novel that a lengthy trial sequence would have detracted from. Whilst this is undoubtedly true to a point, I feel that having Melmotte quietly shuffle off in private fits with the novel's pessimistic tone. There's no sense of sort of catharsis or reflection that a public trial would have allowed. And I think one other significant aspect of the Melmotte conclusion is that the collapse of the Melmotte scheme has little long-term impact on anyone. We are told that when Melmotte's affairs were ultimately wound up, there was found to be nearly enough to satisfy all proved liabilities, and that those able to prove direct debts, the condition at the last was not very sad. There's a sort of a brief mention that Mr. Breggett will be unable to afford a second home, which results in the breaking off of his engagement with the mercenary Georgiana Longstaff, and that's about it. As one critic observes, there's no suggestion of panic or even mild upheaval in the collapse of Melmotte and his grand scheme. Melmotte's death does not break up society. And I think what we can sort of infer from this, as there is no sort of significant calamity from Melmotte's downfall, there is no sort of catalyst for reform or change. So I'm about to sort of contradict myself here, but in some ways, though, I think Melmotte's centrality to the novel is a bit misleading. Although he is the pivot on which the novel turns, I think what the novel is really concerned with is the sort of society that has allowed Melmotte to flourish. I think you'd be hard pressed to argue that Trollope thought the aristocrats of this novel were best and fittest to rule. We remember the book for the sort of ingratiating nobility who revolve around Melmotte, who scramble for invites to his balls and dinners, who, as Trollope puts it, settle upon his carcass as so many birds of prey. And I think it is for them really that Trollope reserves his real ire. And I think, like we see a bit in Dr. Thorne, I think the way we live now is essentially concerned with exploring the vacuum that's left by the extinction of feudalism, and that broadly speaking, the novel is a criticism of an aristocracy that fails to abide by the chivalric code, rather than perhaps a critique of the aristocracy itself. I do think, though, the novel is a somewhat nostalgic response to a culture in which finance and globalization have deeply penetrated, and a longing for the old world of Squire Carberry. So I'm finishing up, but I think it's interesting that perhaps by delving into Trollope a little deeper in this way, we perhaps realise that the endings of his fiction aren't as sort of satisfactory or unified as they might sort of superficially appear. I think sometimes we forget too that despite whatever draws us to Trollope, that he was a deep thinker and he thought about what he wanted to convey and tried to get us to think about Victorian life. I think as he gets older too, his sort of early optimism of the Barchester novels wanes as the castles in the air give way to a feeling that perhaps all is not quite right in Victorian Britain. Yet I think one of Trollope's many skills, and one of the reasons I like him so much, is that we can enjoy Trollope for all the idealism and kindness his works exude, whilst also noting the ways in which his views and outlook perhaps subvert our expectations. So that's the end there. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today.